I'm Yxta Maya Murray, and I'm here to talk to you about the law of contracts. We're here to think about the types of contracts that art galleries can and perhaps should be undertaking with artists, curators, and the surrounding social environment. Our goal is to create the conditions that art galleries may create that will help promote human flourishing. To that end, I'll be laying out the elements of a contract that is enforceable in a court of law. The law of contracts is complicated, and many times, even when you set forth general rules of contracts interpretation, they may be subjected to limitations or exceptions. So please note that I'm laying out the law of contracts in its simplest terms. After we lay out the elements of a successful contract, I'll give you some hypotheticals of contracts that are and are not enforceable in a court of law. After that, I'll be talking about the curious and refreshing etymology of contracts language. While the law of contracts is not designed with human flourishing in mind, nor is it concerned with the particular problems of human vulnerability, there is some potential and promise in the etymology and the etymological history of some of our most commonplace contractual terms. All right. We're going to get started. Let's look at the essential elements of an enforceable contract. First, we need an offer. Every good contract needs an offer. That means that one person says to another, if I do this, will you do that? So there's our offer. Our second element is an acceptance. That's where the other person accepts the offer. The other person will have to say, yes, if you do this, then I'll do that. Offer and acceptance. What else do we need? Consideration. Consideration, what does that mean? Consideration means that there must be value bargained for. The value here is not going to be purely emotional. It has to be value that can be measured on a metric. So for example, if I tried to engage in a contract where I said to someone, I will love you if you will love me, that's not going to be enforceable in a court of law. Even though the poets say that love is the force that drives all of our lives, it doesn't have any market value. Otherwise, such a contract is going to be deemed void for public policy. How are you going to enforce something like that? If you did, it would look more like a contract for prostitution. So we have offer, acceptance, consideration. What else do we need? Many, or even maybe most contracts need what's called mutuality of obligation. That means that we have to promise to do something that we are not otherwise obligated to do, or promise to not do something that we are legally entitled to do. Finally, there might be a writing requirement. If this is a contract that will not be fulfilled within under a year, then it must be in writing in the state of New York, as well as many other jurisdictions. That might be able to get you an enforceable contract. Those are explicit contracts. There's also implied in fact contracts. These exist where a contract is established based on conduct and a reasonable person's interpretation of that conduct. This will exist where the plaintiff has furnished a service or a property to the defendant. The plaintiff reasonably can have expected to receive that payment. The defendant reasonably should have known that a person in the plaintiff's shoes would have expected payment. And finally, the defendant had the opportunity to reject the property or the services and refuse to do so. Hypothetical number 1. Anne offers Barbara $100 to paint Anne's house. Barbara accepts. They have entered into a contract. Anne is under an obligation to pay $100, and Barbara is obligated to paint the house. Hypothetical number 2. Barbara has supplied Anne with milk on her doorstep for the past 10 years. The way that they've arranged it is Barbara goes to Anne's house, puts milk on the steps, and gets the money that Anne has earlier put under the doormat. On the day in question, Barbara brings milk to Anne's house, but no money is there. Anne drinks the milk, but won't pay. There is an implied in fact contract. Hypothetical number 3. Widget's Gallery promises that it will amplify the voices of BIPOC artists. This is not likely to be an enforceable contract. Widget's Gallery has made a promise, but no one else is obligated to act or to refrain from acting. It is also possible that the terms of the agreement are too ambiguous to be enforceable. What does it mean to amplify the voices of BIPOC artists? Just might be too vague to enforce. We see that issues of vulnerability and bargaining power, relative bargaining power, are not central to this contract's analysis. For example, in my hypothetical involving Anne and Barbara's agreement that Anne would pay $100 if Barbara painted her house, we didn't ask about the state of their health, what kind of life chances each person might have experienced or had access to, their placement in the class structure. Nothing like that really was central to our analysis. And this makes us worry. If we live in a society that is rife with racism, sexism, classism, queerphobia, disableism, then we would love it if we had a contracts law that could reflect that. And so for that reason, we're going to try to take a look at the etymology of contracts language to see if there's some promise for an egalitarian contracts law that is not currently present in contracts doctrine. As I noted already, enforceable contracts require an offer. Offers must be tendered. That means to offer formally. Tender comes from the Proto-Indo-European root word ten, which means to stretch. Ten is also the root word for tender in the meaning of soft and easily injured. Consideration. We remember that for there to be an enforceable contract, there has to be consideration. Something of value must be bargained for. Well, consideration comes from the 14th century Old French considération, which means contemplation, reflection. This is from the Latin considerationem, which means to look at closely, to observe. Consideration began to signify sympathetic regard in English in the 1400s. Then there's mutuality, right? Remember, we need, in many cases, mutuality of obligation for there to be an enforceable contract. Well, mutuality means reciprocally given and received. It comes from the 14th century Old French mutuelle, which originally applied to feelings. And then there's obligation. Obligation comes from the Old French obligation. That means obligation, duty, responsibility, from the early 13th century. Obligation comes from obligare, which means literally to bind, and has a rare connotation of bandaging or putting a dressing on a person who is wounded. So, we can see that within this linguistic history of these terms are admonitions to think deeply, to contemplate, to stretch beyond our original positions, to recognize the easily injured, have sympathetic regard, share feelings, and offer assistance. One question for us in this project is whether we can reinvest the modern contract with these values.